Hello, my name is Melody LeBaron, and I've been invited to speak today about what is often considered unmentionable, unspeakable in our Western world. I'm here to talk about the initiation of loss and why loss is so resisted in our culture. I'm here to invite you into a deeper, more intimate relationship with grief. So let's start by taking a deep breath together. I've lit a candle to represent my intention that our conversation today will bring some illumination to what is often considered very painful. In his book, Legacy of the Heart, Wayne Mueller writes, "There inevitably comes a moment in each of our lives after which everything changes, after which we walk on the earth a little bit differently, and we feel our place here with a heightened kind of awareness. Usually, this moment is some kind of suffering. It might be a divorce, or the loss of a job, or being diagnosed with a terminal illness, or losing someone we love, a parent, or God forbid, a child. And after that moment, the way we are on the earth is changed forever. We cannot live our lives by accident any longer because something in that loss, that grief, that heartache galvanizes our attention. We listen more closely to everything. We watch more carefully for what's true. We try to sense with every cell of our body the inner balance of things. My own invitation to grief work came through the losses of my most intimate relationships. I have midwifed the deaths of now 12 of my closest loved ones. My mother died in my arms in 1990 when I was 35. My younger sister died 5 years later. But it was when my 17-year-old son Logan was injured in a car accident in 1997 and died in our arms 3 days later that the sword of truth cleaved my heart open and severed the illusion from the truth of my life. I soon realized that to survive and thrive after this loss, I would require support. In the first months after Logan's death, I vacillated between a numb stuckness and an anguish so intense I wanted to die. Back then, I was frightened that there was no way out of this black hole of my grief. You've all heard the quote that when the student is ready, the teachers appear. Well, life had made me ready, and my teachers appeared with their support as I integrated this terrible loss. All that was false in me fell away and made room for authentic personal power to take its place. And all that was false in my life fell away and made room for the authentic, vulnerable, real relationships I now enjoy. Which is why I've entitled my remarks, Transforming Grief. Because grief, when allowed to do its work in us, transforms us. But our culture isn't set up to allow us to welcome grief. What I've learned by befriending grief is that if we do not feel the grief, if we do not allow it to move through us, if we try to spiritual bypass our grief by stuffing it down or rising above it, walling it off, or closing up, we will end up wearing our grief like body armor for the rest of our lives. What I discovered is that when I was actually willing to feel my grief instead of resisting it, the closer I actually felt to Logan. Yes, those waves of grief were searingly painful, burning through all of my hopes and expectations for my future. But on the other side of that fire, on the other side of that grief, was an increased capacity to feel and embody love, the love and the joy that Logan had brought into my life. Integrating Logan's death allowed me to release my old identity so that even more love could flow through my life. Make no mistake, grief is a painful initiation. We do well to think of our grief work as the work of our soul. It was Kahlil Gibran who said, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy it can contain." When grief is felt and processed all the way through, it transforms into life force, into fuel that revitalizes us and propels us forward. But when grief is ignored, tamped down, and buried alive, our very vitality is buried with it. Our ancestors accepted grief as a normal, natural part of life. They knew that grief buried alive kills the mind, the body, the soul. When a loss happened to one member of the tribe, it was processed and grieved by the entire tribe. They created ritual that allowed the loss to be fully felt within the support and container of loving community. When did that change? When did grief become privatized, individualized? Well, to understand how it changed, we have to go back before the beginning of Western civilization. We have to understand the term anima mundi, which means the soul of the world, of which we are a part. Plato adhered to this idea. He wrote, "The world is indeed a living being, endowed with a soul and intelligence, a single, visible, living entity containing all other living entities, which by their nature are related." But as patriarchy was gaining dominance in the Middle Ages, the word soul was privatized by St. Augustine. And within 100 years, the idea that the world had a soul or that each of us is connected to all other beings on our planet had fallen out of Western consciousness. In our Western world, the paradigm became, "I think, therefore I am," which led to the preferring of logical, linear, individualistic left brain functions and demoted the holistic, creative, we're all connected right brain functions. The Western world became an either or experience of dualism. When I work with clients who are grieving a loss or preparing for death, I have to undo this Western world conditioning. I share with them this continuum. I believe that we took birth as mortals in order to experience the full range of human experience. However, this patriarchal Western conditioning leads to a bifurcation, a division of this experience. It divides human experience into what I call comfortable and uncomfortable. However, our conditioning in the foundation of our patriarchal system was to call everything above the midline good, everything comfortable good, and everything uncomfortable, whenever we experienced a loss, was called evil. Remember how in the Old Testament, Job's friends condemned him because of his misfortunes and losses. So what does that lead to? It leads to a striving for perfection or seeming perfection, which leads to shame when we try to hide from everything that's uncomfortable. Instead of integrating it and allowing it to give us its wisdom, we start to hide it. We start to bury it alive. We start to cover it over with shame. And that leads to projecting our shadow, what's uncomfortable, onto others, which harms all of us. Our country, America, is only just beginning to awaken to the powerful negative consequences of this paradigm, which resulted in colonization, white supremacy, racism, and slavery. Losses that you and I have inherited, and we must now participate in grieving so that we can heal them. Because until we see a loss, we can't grieve it. And until we grieve it, we can't heal it. The South African word Ubuntu conveys the unique preciousness of every life and the value to the village that each life holds. Ubuntu means I am because we are, a very different paradigm than what holds Western culture together. Ubuntu reminds villagers that each person's gifts and skills increase the likelihood of everyone's survival. Sharing and cooperation are the foundation of life, rather than scarcity and competition. And not just the sharing of joy, the sharing of abundance. They knew that grief must also be shared so that the tribe could survive. Grief must also be shared so that we can survive. I consider James Hillman, who graduated from Trinity College in Dublin in 1950 with a degree in mental and moral science and went on to study archetypal psychology. I consider him a thought leader whose work expands Western paradigm, Western consciousness. After he had studied the ancient alchemists, he wrote this about loss and grief and suffering. The alchemists, he said, had an excellent image for the transformation of suffering and symptom into the value of the soul. I'm going to read that again. The alchemist had an excellent image for the transformation of suffering and symptom into the value of the soul. A goal, he wrote, of the alchemical process was the pearl of great price. The pearl starts off as a bit of grit, a neurotic symptom, or a loss, a complaint, a bothersome irritant inside one's secret inner self, which no defensive shell can protect oneself from. This is coded over, worked at, day in, day out, until the grit is a pearl. Yet it still must be fished up out of the depths, out of the deep, and pried loose. And then, when this grit is redeemed, it must be worn. It must be worn on warm skin in order to keep its luster. The redeemed loss, which once caused so much suffering, is now exposed to the public view as a virtue. To get rid of symptom means to get rid of the chance to gain what one day may become your greatest value, even if at first it is unbearably difficult, lowly, and disguised. So what begins as our greatest suffering may have wisdom that not only evolves our own individual soul, but the soul of our community, which is how the South Africans experience suffering together. In his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, my teacher, Francis Weller, talks about the 5 gates of grief. These are 5 portals that we enter to experience grief. Some of the gates you will be very familiar with, but others might be unfamiliar because they're mostly untouched, unmentioned in our culture. So as I describe these 5 gates of grief, I'd like you to ask yourself, in how many ways am I actively experiencing or resisting each of these? The first gate of grief is the familiar one. The first gate of grief is everything we love, we will lose. This mortal life is a life of impermanence. Birth and death are the bookends, and every loss along the way, the loss of job, the loss of home, relationship, identity, loved ones, prepares us for the final loss, the loss of letting go of this mortal body. The second gate of grief is our shadow. And this refers to everything that we have kept hidden, covered over with shame, everything we don't want to love or acknowledge, the parts of us that have been banished from our consciousness. We often hate these parts of ourselves so much, it becomes so uncomfortable that we can't feel them. We can only project them out onto others, the enemy, people we so dislike. Or if the shame stays hidden, it turns into self-hate, which never allows it to be grieved. The third gate of grief is the sorrows of the world, the sorrows of anima mundi. Whether we know it or not, we are an organism living on and in the body and the soul of Mother Earth. And we are affected by the polluting, by the raping, by the destruction of Mother Earth, our precious planet. The fourth gate of grief is what we expected but did not receive. At this gate, we realized, whether we are aware of it or not, there is much that we expected and it did not receive. And one of those expectations is the presence and the support and the containment of a community. We are born wired to expect a certain degree of welcome and engagement, touch and connection. We expected what our ancestors had, a village to care for us, to welcome us, where we had a sense of belonging. When we realize that Western culture is not set up this way, this calls forth grief. How many people do you know who feel they do not belong in their family or in their culture? Our society is filled with people who feel empty, who don't have a sense of purpose, who don't know how to bring forth their gifts in a way that blesses their community. The fifth and final gate of grief is only just beginning to be talked about by experts in this country. The fifth and final gate of grief is ancestral grief. Ancestral grief refers to the traumatic losses held in our genetic memory and in our very DNA, experienced by our ancestors. The book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a wonderful book that speaks to the ancestral losses of white bodies, Black bodies, and even blue bodies, police bodies. It's a very important work. In the Western world, when we've gone through the first gate of grief, when we've lost something we loved, we're often allowed a few days off of work if we lost a loved one, but we're expected to bounce back, to show up as our normal self after a few days or a week. And we don't even have language to culturally acknowledge the other four gates of grief. And yet each of these losses are initiations, portals meant to mature our souls, which is why I'm inviting you today to begin to release old Western indoctrinations around grief and loss and to welcome it, to become curious about it. By welcoming suffering and trauma, we bring curiosity, expansion, and life force back into our bodies, back into our consciousness. By working with grief and loss in this way, we become opening to release our individual experience of separation, how our losses make us different from everyone else, separation and shame. Shame holds the unspoken agreement. I am unspeakably, irreparably defective. We have to move out of shame. We have to move from feeling worthless into feeling wounded. When we feel worthless, we hold contempt for ourselves and or others. But when we feel wounded, we hold compassion for our wounded selves. We recognize I've been through a loss. I should be allowed to grieve my loss. We share our wounds with others who've been wounded. My teacher, Clarissa Pincoli Estes, calls us the Scar Clan. And after 2020, don't all of us belong to the Scar Clan? Don't all of us have a closer connection to someone who's lost a loved one to COVID-19 or to someone whose job has been impacted by the pandemic? When we share these wounds, we can grieve, which allows us the life force to heal. If we don't share our wounds, if we don't come out into the open with our losses, we keep them hidden in silence. And shame grows in silence, but it integrates, it diminishes when it's shared. I'd like to share a poem with you called Phone Call by Tony Hoagland, in which this migration from a shame-filled identity to a wounded and healing identity becomes evident. Maybe I overdid it when I called my father an enemy of humanity. That might have been a little strongly put, a slight over-exaggeration, an immoderate description of the person who, at that moment, 2,000 miles away, holding the telephone receiver 6 inches from his ear, might have regretted paying for my therapy. What I meant was that my father was an enemy of my humanity. What I meant behind that was that my father was split into two people, one of them living inside me like a bad king or an incurable disease, blighting my crops, striking down my herds, poisoning my wells. The other standing in another time zone, in a kitchen in Wyoming with bad knees and white hair sprouting from his ears. I don't want to scream forever. I don't want to live without proportion, like some kind of infection from the past. So I have to remember the second father, the one whose TV dinner is getting cold while he stares into the phone in his left hand and then blankly stares out the window where just now the sun is going down and the last fingertips of sunlight are withdrawing from the hills they once touched like a child. In that beautifully expressed poem, you feel the rage of the wounded child when he calls his father an enemy of humanity. And you feel the maturation process, the separation out of shame as he describes his own inner father like a bad king or incurable disease. We sense that the poet himself has done so much inner work to transform that inner father to a more helpful, benevolent influence, even as we can feel at the end of the poem his compassion for his aging father who was once a child. This is the kind of work that happens and can only happen when we fully feel and grieve our losses. So I have some questions for us. And as I ask these questions about what we're grieving, I'd like you to choose a loss that feels either personal for you or something that's going on in the collective that you feel grief about. Because when we grieve our own individual losses, or whether we grieve something that's going on in the collective, we contribute to the healing of what's going on in our collective consciousness. So notice what is happening in your body as you choose a loss and answer these questions. The first question is there another way that I could hold this loss? Remember that our Western culture wants us to separate from and resist. Is there another way you can hold this loss? What would it feel like to release my resistance to this loss, to relax, to surrender in the face of this grief, to open to it, to feel it all the way through? One of the most wonderful books I've ever read on loss, written by Stephen Cope. It's a yoga book, actually. And he talks about grief and loss and how it impacts us right here in the body. We constrict our breathing. We don't fully breathe. It closes down the heart. We begin to hunch over. And yet, when we feel the waves of grief, they usually never last longer than 90 seconds at a time. Are you able to breathe through a searing, painful wave of grief for 90 seconds? Do you think you can do that? If so, that grief can give its medicine to you. That wound can begin to heal. Am I willing to experience the heat of my grief in these 90-second waves so it can burn through me and leave me an open and clear channel for love and life force to flow? For those of you who would like to explore the revitalizing power of grief work further, please go to my website, transformingspace.com, and sign up to receive my resiliency visualizations. Later in February, I'm co-facilitating an online grief retreat. And if it calls to you, I'd love to have you join us. I do these at least twice a year, these grief retreats. So in closing, I'd like to share a poem called Kindness, which beautifully describes one of the biggest blessings of grief work well done. Kindness by Naomi Nye. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it until your voice catches the thread of all the sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. It's my hope that all of us will know kindness for ourselves and others, even those with whom we disagree, as the deepest thing inside. Thank you. Thank you so much for being willing to walk with grief alongside me.